describe your earliest memory?
My earliest memories were about going to nursery and I don't know, probably can't do this, you know. My dad died when I was only 2.5, so my mum had to go to work, and so me and Alan went to nursery. And my first memories were my peg, which was a swan, and every day we had to go and go for a sleep in the afternoon, and we would have to queue up for a teaspoon of cod liver oil and some orange juice every day. So this was the state keeping children, or trying to keep children healthy after the war. And I went there. My teacher was Miss Kingsley, and my nurse was called Anne, who I met up with in later life in my church.
Your nurse? What do you mean?
Well, you had a nursery nurse as well. You had a nursery nurse, and she looked after your physical needs, I suppose, and Miss Kingsley was the one who taught you. And I went to St George's School when I was 5, and my first teacher was Mrs Lewis, and I still saw her in town just before she died a few years ago, and still talked to her. When I was 11, I took the 11 plus and went to grammar school, which was a big thing for my mum because it was expensive in those days. And my brother went the year after me as well, so both of us went to grammar school.
So what was school like? Tell us a bit more about school. What sort of subjects did you do?
I studied Latin for 3 years, which today is unheard of almost, but in those days, if you wanted to go to Oxford, you had to have Latin. So everybody in a grammar school at 11 years of age started off learning Latin just in case. But maths was one of my subjects, and English, the sciences. I didn't take the route of the arts, I went science route and did chemistry and physics and biology. And I still use some of my physics lessons in my electrical things in the home today. And that's where I learned to wire a plug or change a light socket, or I can even change a plug socket, and I can still do that, and that's from my physics lessons at school. So a lot of it came in useful.
Did you get a lot of homework?
Well, I thought so. Maybe today they might not think the same, but yeah, we did.
How long did it take you to do your homework each night?
Well, it went, as you went through the school, it went up. You know, I think you started with about a half an hour, and then an hour, and it would go up to about 2 hours, I think. So it was quite a lot. But in those days, the learning was completely different to where it is today.
So?
Much more intense. There was none of this just understanding. You had to know how to do it. English was all about subject and predicate and box analysis and sentence construction. It was not just this comprehension of things and the best guess of 3. You had to know. So it was, and I think maths is so much different today. I couldn't even tell you about that because I don't understand what they do today. It's just so different.
Did you do sports at school?
I did. I was a runner. I was not a long distance runner like Sarah. I was a sprinter, and I used to run in the relays and do the 100 yards as it was then. Yeah, and I played hockey, and I was quite good at tennis at school. Rounders, I was good. I was a good bowler, and of course I was a good runner in rounders to get round the rounders thing. So yeah, I enjoyed sport.
What was Alan like at school?
About the same as me, I suppose. He wasn't a keen student, but he was clever. His big thing was sport, football. He was the junior school champion at school.
What does that mean, junior school champion?
He earned the most. In the grammar school, you were divided into houses, and it was Jutes, Angles, Saxons. And if one of your family went into one house, that your family followed suit. So we were both in Jutes, and he won the most points for events in his year. So he was, well, his year, it was the first 3 years, I think, and he was the junior school champion.
So the points were for running, jumping?
I can't remember really his best points apart from football. Football was his big thing, and he supported Manchester United all his life. So yeah.
So, what outside of school? What sort of thing went on? What was the family life like?
Well, when my mum was widowed, she couldn't afford the rent in the house that we were in, so we had to move, and we moved to a much inferior house, a house that had no running hot water or inside toilet. In fact, the toilet was shared outside, and it was a brew house for doing the washing and all that sort of thing. So that's where we grew up, in Union Street in Redditch, which was then opposite the batteries, Alcad Batteries factory. Now, a big, what's that? I can't think of the name. B&Q. This big B&Q, where the batteries factory used to be now, and Asda. So that's all changed down there.
So, what happened with the outside toilet if you needed to go to the bathroom in the night?
Well, if you needed to go in the night, you had a gazund at the bed. But if you needed to go to the toilet during the evening when it was dark and that, I remember we used to go in twos. Alan would come with me with a torch or something, or I would go with him, and that's the way we did it. It's unheard of today, and it's just in my lifetime. Things have changed so much.
So, how did you have a bath if there was no hot water?
Well, in those days it was an old tin bath that had to be brought in and put in front of the fire, because again there was no central heating. And it was just filled up. The water was heated in the wash boiler and then put into the bath, and that was it. There was no fresh water for everybody coming after you. Everybody bathed in the same water, and it certainly wasn't a bath every day like that, and twice a day sometimes these days. Things were so much different in those days. It was once a week, if you were lucky.
Nobody had any showers either?
No, there was no showers in those days that I knew of anyway. We didn't even have a bathroom, so there wouldn't have been a shower. No, just unheard of.
Tell us about your family in terms of, you know, your mom and her mother, etc. Who was in the family? How many children?
Well, my mum was one of 5 children, and she was the youngest and a twin.
Who were the other children?
Uncle Jim was the eldest, and then Auntie Em, Uncle Fred, and then my mum and Auntie Win, and of course they're all dead now, which is why I can't talk about it.
Tell us more about your gran. You spent a lot of time with her.
I spent a lot of time with my granny when I was growing up, and if you ask any of the other grandchildren, they'd probably tell you I was her favourite. I got the best of everything, whereas they had what was left. That's a big joke in the family. But I used to spend quite a lot of time with her. I used to go and stay with her 1 week every month. That was because the other 3 weeks she would be looking after her boyfriend up Beeley Road, and he went away to his daughter every month. So then she was at home and I had to go and stay with her. And so I did spend a lot of time with my granny, which I'm quite grateful for these days.
So what sort of things happened in those weeks you stayed with her?
Well, I remember my granddad, because she was awful to him, and he wasn't allowed to live in the normal part of the house. He was only allowed to live in a bathroom which was off the kitchen, and that was where the bath was. My granny did have a bathroom because she lived in a council house in Sillins Avenue, and she used to be quite horrible to him. I don't know what happened. Nobody ever told us what happened in the marriage, but certainly there was a big rift, and she was the one who held the upper hand all the time. He never fought her, but oh my God, that's where he ate his food. My Auntie Em did his washing, and every week she wouldn't do that, and that was his life. Even in the bedroom, he wasn't allowed an electric light, which they had. He had a candle, and that's the only light he had in the bathroom, was a candle. And that was it. He worked in the BSA in Redditch and came home at night and read his paper by candlelight, and that was his life, and he just seemed to put up with it. He died in 1956 when I was 10, obviously, and yeah, I remember because it was Easter Saturday, and he'd been ill for a while, and I think the story was that they did get together again just before he died, but none of us know what went wrong in the marriage. My granny was like a street angel and a home devil, really. I can't remember one night coming home, and I don't know what he'd done, but he'd done something that she didn't agree with, and I seen her put a carving knife on him and draw blood. And I remember, because the blood looked so red, that's what's always stuck in my mind. And yeah, that was life in them days, I suppose. But she'd still be tripping to church every Sunday morning and, you know, letting people think she was a good, I suppose in her own way she was good, but she wasn't very good to him. And she was good to me. She was good to me.
Didn't she teach you to cook?
Yeah, I got a lot of my cooking things from my granny, and yeah, cleaning and all that, you know, watching her. She was in service. She went into service when she was very young, because both my granddad and my granny were actually born in Worcester. My granddad in Crown East and my granny in a place called, the locals call it Pike, but it's spelled P-O-W-I-C, Powick, which are both like suburbs of Worcester. And my granny's family were the lock keepers. They lived by the river and they were the lock keepers. I remember that he had 2 sisters and she had 2 brothers and a sister. Her sister was called Gladys, which my mother must have been named after her. And that's where the red hair comes from on my granny's side of the family, on my side of the family. Because my Auntie Glad had red hair. My granny used to take us to Worcester on the bus regularly when we were little. Wynne would come with us sometimes, and I remember where they lived it was even worse, because they didn't even have running water. All they had was a well, which you had to pump to get water. There was no water closet. It was just kind of a bucket thing down the garden, and which had to be emptied and buried. That's the way they lived in those days. And all this is in my lifetime.
This was the 1950s?
Yeah, 1950s. And it's just unbelievable that life has changed so much. We take everything for granted these days, but in those days it was hard.
What do you know about your granddad then? You said he served in the First World War.
My granddad, he did serve in the First World War, and when he came home from the war, he came to Redditch, because Redditch had built a lot of houses for soldiers coming back from the First World War. Sillins Avenue and Beeley Road, bottom of Beeley Road, is a prime example. These houses were built specifically for soldiers. So they came to Redditch to live in this house. And my mum and Auntie Wynne, they were born in Redditch. I'm not sure about my Uncle Fred. My mum was born in 1920, which was after the war. I'm not sure when my Uncle Jim was born, who was the oldest. My Uncle Fred also served, he served in the Second World War. He was a soldier in the Second World War. And my Uncle Jim was a member of the Home Guard, but he didn't actually go to war. My mum worked in Terry's during the war, which I think they did things for the war effort, I'm not sure. They made a lot of springs, Terry's springs, so probably they were doing things, but she was a plater, what they call a plater. And yeah, that's where that's where she returned to work after my dad died. And she worked there for until she married again, and she married a second time when I was 5, and had 2 more children, Helen and John, and that was our family then until I left to get married. I didn't actually leave, I stayed living with my mum for a while, but then I went to live with my granny in Sillins Avenue until I got my own place in Batchley.
Tell us about your dad's side of the family. What do you know about them?
My dad was Scottish, and he was born in Scotland to George Andrew Stronach, and his mother's name was Elizabeth. Hence, my name is Elizabeth as well, because that was the thing in those days. They called their first child after their mother. And he had brothers Tom and Rob and Jim and Geordie and I can't remember anymore. And he had one sister called Peggy. And I never knew much about my family in Scotland because my dad had died, and my mum told me what she knew. But the first time I met any of my dad, apart from Uncle Jim, who lived in Birmingham, was when I was 11 and I went to Scotland with my cousin Susan. We went for 6 weeks to spend with my Auntie Peggy. My mum always told the story that my Auntie Peggy wanted to take me and Alan when we were babies and my dad died, because she only had one child. And she would have liked to have us to bring us up, but my mum wouldn't let us go. And so it was nice. And then when I went to Scotland, I obviously got to know my Auntie Peggy. She was married to Uncle Bobby and Betty, as she was called, and so was I when I was little, was her only child. She, of course, was called after my granny as well. There was an Elizabeth in most families, all called after our grandmother. And those 6 weeks I spent, I got to know Auntie Peggy, and I was taken to see my Uncle Tom, and he had daughters called Margot and Elizabeth, again. And so I got to know them then, but I didn't keep in contact only with my Auntie Peggy and Betty, who I went to see most years until she died a couple of years ago when she was 17. She had cancer as well. Cancer is a blight of our family. There's been so many deaths through cancer, it's unbelievable. I am the one who had cancer and survived. So hence I've lived longer than a lot of my family.
Tell us about your cousin Susan's side of the family. You mentioned going to Scotland with her.
Susan was the daughter of my Uncle Jim and Auntie Connie, who lived in Birmingham, and she had a brother John and a sister Mary, and I've always kept in touch with them. So all the things, most of the things that I learned about my family, I suppose I learned from there. And Susan and I stayed in contact, and until she died. She died, I can't remember now, it's got to be 5 or 6 years, maybe more. Again, she died from cancer.
So let's focus on the death. What was Susan like? You said you were together, you grew up together.
She was a dozy dolly. She saw the good in everybody, never saw the bad in anybody. She was so kind. She was married to Des, and she had 2 boys, Jimmy and Des was her lad's name as well. And she never lived to see her first grandchild, which is very sad. Jimmy, he went to university in Ireland, and Des was a bit of a bad boy in his younger days, but I think he's settled down now. And I suppose he was like his granddad a bit. He was a bit of a bad boy as well, my Uncle Jim, but heart of gold. And yeah.
You said your Uncle Jim would bring you things when you were younger?
Yeah, he used to come and see me and Alan regularly. He used to come on a motorbike from Birmingham to Redditch. Always kept in touch. And that was the link.
So going back to staying with your gran, when you went to stay with her, you said, you'd mentioned one time you also slept in the same bed.
I always slept in the same bed with her. This big feather mattress, it was such a comfortable bed, but I always slept with her. Ian thinks that's a bit strange, but that's the way life was in those days.
You said you would get loaned out to other people to go and stay with them, and you'd have to sleep with them as well.
I did, yeah. There used to be a lady who lived up the road, Alice. I can't remember her surname now. And she was known to us because I grew up in the Methodist church, and I used to sing when I was a little girl and sing a lot on my own in church, and she used to play the piano. And they used to teach me to sing, and I remember when she was ill, they sent me to stay with her at night, and I slept with her as well, so nobody thought anything about it in those days. It was just life.
Tell us about the church and the stuff you used to get up to in Sunday school and things.
Well, as I say, when I was a little girl, I grew up, and the Methodist church was at the top of, because I lived down in Union Street, and the Methodist church was at the top of Lodge Road. So that's where I went to church 3 times a day, because I used to go in the morning, and then it was like a junior church, and then we went up into church for the service. In the afternoon we went to Sunday school, and then in the evening I was the only child member of the choir, and we went at night to sing, and it was such a happy time really in the church, much more so than today, but because there was Christian Endeavour, and there was we used to have socials on a Saturday night, and it was a bit of a highlight of the week. But then there wasn't the distractions in those days that there are today. People these days wouldn't think that was good fun. But in my day it was, and I enjoyed it. And went to church regularly.
Talking about fun, so what sort of things would you do on a Saturday? You used to go to the cinema sometimes.
When I was a little girl, we used to go to the Gaumont on a Saturday morning, and all the kids in the town used to go. You'd queue up outside and you'd pay 6pence and go in and see films. Some of them were serials, Flash Gordon, Old Mother Riley, are 2 I remember. I don't remember any others so much, but that was considered such a good way to spend a Saturday morning in those days. And 6pence, yeah, that was your pocket money gone. 2.5 these days.
So you talked about singing. Didn't you also want to learn the piano at one point?
Well, my dad always said that when I was 10 he would buy me a piano, and so when I was 10, I think my mum cashed in my dad's post-war credits or something, but she got some money and she bought me this piano, and there is a picture of me sitting at this piano to this day. And so my mum sent me to piano lessons, and it used to be an old man. His name was Mr. Harben, I think, and I think he lived in Queen Street, which was an old part of Redditch, and I used to go around there every week for this lesson, but I didn't like it. For some reason I didn't like it. Many regrets today, because I wish I had stuck at it and done it, but I didn't. But even from those 12 months of lessons, today I can play a melody on the piano with the right hand, but that's it. So it wasn't totally lost. I can remember some of the things he taught me, but after a year I took my 11 plus, and which meant I was going to the grammar school, and so I talked to my mum about it and said that I didn't think I would be able to continue with the piano lessons and do all the homework, and she finally agreed with me, so I stopped.
What do you remember about Christmas when you were young?
Christmas was a very exciting time when I was young, much more so than today, and at Christmas time nothing was put up in the house until Christmas Eve. No decorations, no tree, nothing was done until after we'd gone to bed on Christmas Eve. So we came down on Christmas morning and everything was Christmassy. It was indeed Christmas, and we didn't get the presents in those days that the children get today, but I think we appreciated them far more. And the one gift I do remember from when I was a little girl is when I had a sewing box, and to me that was the best thing out. I can remember that sewing box to this day because I was interested in knitting and sewing and things that children today can't do, and it's a lost art. My grandkids today can't thread a needle. Any sewing that needs to be done has to come to me. And I don't know what they're going to do after me. I'm sure I've even asked them this and they say they don't know. But yes, Christmas was a magical time. We used to go carol singing for money for Christmas. And in those days, it wasn't like today when you can't let your kids out. We used to go all over Redditch. And because I was a good singer, people would call me in to sing in their house. People I didn't know, and I would go in and sing a carol, and they'd pay me, and off I'd trot, pleased as punch. And that was the run up to Christmas. We could make a lot of money carol singing. I'm not saying I went on my own because I didn't.
Did Alan go with you?
I don't remember Alan coming with me, but certainly we would sing a carol all the way through, and I still know the words to the carols today. Wasn't like this, we wish you a Merry Christmas, and that was it, and they expect you to hand them money. You did have to earn it, but it was nice in those days, you know. Christmas was Christmas, it was a big thing. I remember in those days, that was the only time of the year that you had chicken. And I remember the chickens getting delivered to my granny's, and they weren't plucked or gutted or anything. And they were put in the bath, a dry bath obviously, until somebody could get round to it and pluck all the feathers and got them ready for Christmas. But chicken tasted different in those days.
So what sort of food would you eat the rest of the year?
I remember that my mum used to stew a lamb's head, and pork bones were a big thing that they would stew. And you know, we ate them. We didn't eat the bones, obviously the bones were picked and all the meat was picked off them. The sheep's head, the meat was picked off those, and even the brains, which were, I quite like them. If I mention that to people today, they just can't believe it, but I quite like them. And yeah, it was mainly stews, and we did have a joint on Sunday, but it wasn't a big joint by any means of the word, and that would probably do Monday as well. I used to get sent down to the butchers. Marsh and Baxter's was the big butchers in Redditch when I was a little girl, and the guy who used to serve the meats to us, he opened his own butcher's shop down Unicorn Hill. So I used to have to go down there every week to get the meat for Sunday when I was a little girl.
How old?
Well, I suppose about 8. And I could do all. I was the eldest of 4 children, so I had plenty about me in that respect, because that's the way I was taught. I was just, if the others did anything wrong, it was always my fault. So I learned quickly.
What about birthdays? Do you remember much about birthdays?
No, they don't stick out in my mind, birthdays, as much as Christmas. I remember that when it was one of our birthdays, we would have a special tea with jelly and fruit and whatnot, and Wyn would come. Wyn, my cousin, she would come down, and she used to come down to my mum's quite regularly. She liked coming to my mum's, Wyn did. And that's why we've remained close even to this day.
What about your other cousins? What do you remember about your other cousins?
Well, Eric was my oldest cousin. He was my Uncle Jim's son, but he was more like one of my granny's children because she reared him. He didn't live with his mum and dad at all. He lived with her. She was evacuated during the war with Eric to Worcester because where they lived in Sillins Avenue, at the bottom of the garden, not far, much further on, was the BSA, which produced guns and that for the war. And so that was a target for the Germans. And in fact, the Germans bombed Redditch, and the bomb site was in I can't remember the name of the road, but it's just off Marsden Road, which was just up the road from where we grew up in Union Street. And that was always called the bomb buildings, and that was where the Germans bombed, missed the BSA, but so yeah, that's my war memories, and I was born after the war, but that was always known as the bomb buildings, and it was made into a playground for us kids, and that's where we played, and it was still called the bomb buildings.
So that was Eric. You had a lot more cousins.
So Eric was my oldest cousin, and the next was Barry, who was Wynn's brother. Unfortunately, Barry died in a motorbike accident when he was only 18. And that was that happened while I was in Scotland in 1957. And so he was next in line. Pam, who was a daughter of my Uncle Fred, who was married to Dorothy, Auntie Doll, they had 2 children, Pam and Margaret, but they weren't allowed to mix with us, the rest of the cousins. So again, there must have been some kind of disagreement in the family, which I don't know anything about. But to this, Pam, unfortunately, is died now. And Margaret, who I see occasionally in Redditch, or the last time I saw her, she came to Eric's funeral, and she doesn't know anything about the family, and she's desperate to know. And I did agree to have her come to the house one day, and I would tell her what I know and show her the photos that I've got, but to my shame I haven't done it yet. But I will get around to that. Auntie Em had 3 children, Barry, who got killed, Wynn, who's 2 years older than me, and Janet, who's a bit older than my brother John. And then my Auntie Wynn, who was my mum's twin, she married an Australian GI and went to Australia in 1946 and never ever came back. She never ever returned to this country. She had 4 children. Eileen, who was born before she went to Australia, Eileen is the same age as me. John, and then she had 2 more children, Ruth and Rodney. And my granddaughter has only recently made contact with them in Australia. So we only recently found out that my Auntie Wynn had died about 10 years ago, which was something I was keen to find out. And I have yet to make more contact with them to tell them about this side of the family and for them to tell me about them. But yeah, that's very sad. My mum's twin and they never ever met up again.
Did you used to go on holiday when you were younger? Do you have any memories of holidays?
The first holiday I remember was when I was 5, and it was just after my mum got married again, and we went to Blackpool for a week, because that's where my stepfather had spent a lot of his youth in his holidays, and so he took us to Blackpool. And there is a photograph of me and Alan walking along with ice creams when we are on that holiday. And then in 1951, John was born, and in 53 Helen was born, and the holidays that I remember were going to Rhyl in a caravan. And we went there a couple of times, all of us. And yeah, I remember.
How did you get there? Because you probably didn't have a car.
I can't remember whether it was train or bus, but it would have been one of the 2. Yeah, there would have been coaches going or trains. I've got a vague memory that we went on the train once, but whether that's true or not, I don't know. It's difficult to remember those things. But I do remember the holidays, and they were good, we enjoyed them. But there wasn't a lot of money about in them days. So,
What were you like as a teenager? What sort of things did you get up to?
I was a rebel, naughty girl. Didn't do as I was told, didn't listen to anybody, thought I knew everything.
Does that remind you of anybody?
Well, when I talk to them about things, I know where they are. Married at 18, the baby at 18.
Before that,
What sort of things did you do for fun when you were 16, 17?
Well, it was the early 60s, and of course it was a new age really for people. We used to go and listen to records, go to dancing at the Palace, which is where I met my husband.
What sort of music did you like?
60s music, all the
For example?
Elvis Presley, Gene Pitney, Connie Francis, that kind of thing, ballad singers and
Who were your
rock and roll.
Who were your friends you went dancing with?
One of my best friends was a girl I was at school with, her name was Diana Burton, and she lived in Millsborough Road. So we spent time together. In general, I think a lot of my friends were older than me. Jennifer Rowe, who she was a friend at school, she was one of my bridesmaids when I got married. I still see her very occasionally because she's quite disabled these days. A lot of girls from school, I still talk to girls from school now when I meet them in town and that, and we have a catch up, and yeah, it was good times. But of course once I was married and had a baby and that, it all changed.
So how did you meet Dad then?
I was very friendly with Billy Finlay, and your dad came down from Scotland in 1960, I think. When I was 14, I met him when I was 14, and I was going out with him when I was 14. And
How old was he at that stage then?
he's 3.5 years older than me.
So he was 18, 17, 18?
17, 18, yeah. And he came down from Scotland because there was no work in Scotland, and Billy Finlay's mum and dad were great friends with your dad's mum, your nana and your granddad, because when they lived in Scotland, your nana and Sue Finlay were big buddies. So they took him in, and he came to the Palace with Billy Finlay one Saturday afternoon, and that's when we met.
And what was he like when he was that age?
He was a gambler then. He was always, he was a hard worker, and John Finlay got him a job in the alloys, and that's where he worked, and very popular in the town all his life. Everybody knew him because he was a barman in the Golden Cross in town, and
Not when he was young, but...
he did it from quite a young age.
Yeah?
Yeah, his second job. It wasn't his full-time job, it was his second job. Your dad would always have liked to run a pub,
Yeah.
but I wouldn't do it.
I remember we came close once.
Well, I think it might have been him and Susan talking.
Okay.
I don't think I ever came close.
So, when did you leave school?
I left school before I took my exams, because by that time I hated school. And I managed to talk my mum around and said if I took the civil service exam, could I leave school? So she agreed. I took the entrance examination for the civil service and got a job in the civil service, which was a good job in those days. And that's when I started in the civil service, when I was only 16, and I worked in Selly Oak. Had to travel by train every day. Used to travel with Jennifer Rowe.
Did she work there too?
She worked there too, yeah. And her dad, John Rowe, he'd worked in the civil service. He worked in the civil service all his life as well. So, yeah.
So what sort of things did you do in the civil service?
Well, I was a clerical assistant, so I worked in the benefits office, and the first job that you did was the initial action of a claim, which was you received the claims when they came in, processed them, sent them through to another person called a rater, who rated how much they had got to be paid, and then they went to another person called a computer in those days, which I became. I did the computer's job, and you computed in your brain the amount of money that had got to be paid to that person. And yeah, And there was lots of other jobs like filing and tracing and all that kind of, which is general office work really. But I did really like it, and I went back to it after my children, after Susan and Ian were born.
So when you left school and started work, where were you living?
Still in Union Street. Yeah.
And then you met Dad and you got married. And where did you live after you got married?
Well, I lived at my mum's first of all, but when Susan was born, I went to live with my granny in Sinners Avenue, and I was there, must have been for nearly 12 months, because I think Susan was nearly 12 months old when we were given a council flat in Batchley. And we lived in Batchley for, well, until Susan went to school. Ian was born in that flat in Batchley.
So just going back a little bit, what do you remember about Susan being born?
Well,
First
our
child.
first baby. She was actually born in the Cottage Hospital in Evesham. So I remember on the day, it was a Thursday, and I'd been to the doctors for my checkup, and I had all this pain in my back, and he gave me this prescription to get some tablets, which we couldn't get in Redditch, and the only place you could get them was Birmingham, and we couldn't get them. But anyway, I remember going to this outside loo, and I remember my mum saying to me, "Don't get pushing on that labour." I said, "I'm not in labour, she's not due yet." But lo and behold, I was in labour, and we had to get an ambulance to go to Evesham in the night. It was in December, because she was born December the 18th, bitter cold, and the ambulance came, and your dad came with me. They took him to Evesham, but they couldn't guarantee to bring him home. So God knows they would have got home if they didn't. But anyway, as it happens, in those days your husband didn't always stay with you in the hospital. And so he came back with the ambulanceman and left me in Evesham. And this was about 3 o'clock in the morning. I went out to Evesham, and Susan was born just before 7. Bouncing girl, 8 pounds 9 ounces with red hair. And I thought to myself, well, maybe that's not so bad, at least she's a girl.
You wanted a girl?
I never dreamt that I would have a girl, because the Hanleys, all the way through, if they only had one boy, which my husband was an only son, it was always a boy first.
Yeah. So Nana had told you were having a boy?
Yeah, and I thought I would have a boy with dark hair.
And you had a girl with red
And
hair?
I had a girl with red hair.
What was Susan like as a baby?
Oh, well, all first babies are lovely, aren't they? You know, you just munch them. Yeah, she was...
So what were those first 3 years like before I came along?
Well, when you've got a first child, and you dote on this child, and you think, well, you know, I don't know whether I can love another child as much as I love this one, but you do. Things change, and that's what happens. And yeah, so Ian came along when she was 3 years of age.
How was my birth different?
It was a home birth, and Ian was born, it was deep snow. The buses had been stopped coming from Batchley to Batchley, and my mum had to walk all the way from Redditch to Batchley. Ian was born, Susan was born Friday morning, and Ian was born Thursday night. But Susan was 10 days early, and Ian was 11 days late. And I went into labour about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and the nurse came in. She was a redhead, the nurse was a redhead herself, and she wouldn't give me the Pethidine, painkiller. She said, "No, I'm not giving you that." She said, "Because you're a redhead and we bleed like stuffed pigs."
Research has since proved that redheads have a higher tolerance to pain.
Yeah, well, there you go. She wouldn't give me the pain. She'd give me the gas and air, but that was it. And I produced a 9-pound baby boy.
Just on gas and air.
At home on gas and air. Yeah.
So the next...
And he had even redder hair. When I saw him, I thought, oh my God, I ain't having any more.
Thanks. So the next 5 years you spent at home with both me and Susan.
I did.
What was that like?
I did a little part-time job when Susan was at school. I used to clean around the Alloys, not the Alloys, Batchley Club.
Is that with Denise? What about the railway? I thought you...
No, I'm never cleaning around.
Oh, okay.
And I used to take you with me. So I did a little job like that, but you and Susan didn't go to play school or anything like that. You stayed with me, and when you went to school, I think you went to school after Christmas because your birthday was in January, and in them days you went nearer your birthday rather than in September. And I applied to go back into the civil service in Redditch this time, and they accepted me. And my mum used to come up and take you to school, and she used to meet you from school because she only lived down the road in Batchley. By this time I'd left the flat in Batchley and we lived in a bungalow.
In Cedar View.
In Cedar View, yeah. And yeah, my mum used to look after you. Nobody else, just my mum. And I just went on from there, and from there I took the exam to become a clerical officer to get promotion, and I passed that with flying colours. I came quite high throughout the country in that. I still had the results of that. Probably they are in the house still somewhere. So I became a clerical officer, and it wasn't too long before I was promoted again and became an executive officer and a supervisor. And I did the benefits side of it. I did all training side of it. I was a training officer. I saw the first computers coming into the department and was part of that.
The non-human computers.
Yeah. And eventually I was promoted for a year on a temporary promotion when I had quite a few staff to look after, and I did a year of that. I could have been promoted permanently, but I didn't want to leave Redditch. If I'd have been willing to leave Redditch and go and travel to work every day and whatnot, I could have been promoted, but I didn't want to. I didn't think it was worth it. So I retired as an executive officer. My final job was a benefit fraud investigator, where I was beaten up by somebody. And
who was taken to court?
Yeah, and found guilty, and yeah. So it was a dangerous job in those days. And we went out on our own. The police don't even do that. We'd go to people's houses on our own. I remember one day I was in this house in Churchill interviewing this man, and he was a murderer. He'd been in jail for murder.
And you knew?
No, not until he told me.
Oh, great. So just going back again a little, at some point we left Cedar View and you bought your first house. What was that like?
Well, first of all, we bought our first car. So your dad and I both passed our driving test on the same day. First time for both of us as well. And so we got a car, and then I decided, that we would save to buy a house. And I suppose it was difficult because wages weren't as high then as what they were in later life. But I think I had to save £500, and the house cost just under 10,000, and it was in Matchborough, and we moved there. Before my mum died, so 78, 79, 78. 78 I went back to work. No, I went back to work in 73.
That makes more sense. I would have been 5.
Yeah, I went back to work in 73. Anyway, I can't remember when we exactly did that, but I know we lived in that house for 2 years, just over 2 years I think, and very happy there. It was obviously moving on to the new town, which in those days was quite a thing. If you were born in Redditch, you kind of didn't like going on to the new town because that was where all the Brummies were.
Never heard that.
But, well, they called the Brummies the 021ers. because that was the phone code. Redditch took the overspill from Birmingham. Redditch was designated a new town, and it took the overspill from Birmingham. But where we went, it was quite nice. And in that close, there were two other girls who worked at the same place as me, who lived in the same close. So Ian found it a bit difficult at first, having to move schools and mix with all new friends. Susan just went into it. She just went to Arravale School, and she was there quite, settled, but Ian found it a bit more difficult. But once he settled in, he was okay. And he went to a new school, and they took him in at a certain level, which I thought was low, and I told the head so, but Ian worked his way up and he was soon in the top classes.
I think that's enough of that.
So yeah, and that's where we stayed until my mum died in 1981, and when she died I needed to do something to take my mind off of that, so I decided that we would move house, and that's what we did. And so we moved to Kingscote Close in Churchill, and I'm still there now.
So what do you remember of Rebecca and Emma and Rachel and Sarah's births?
Well, Rebecca's birth I wasn't involved with really very much, because Rebecca was born in London. I remember Susan phoning me up and telling me that she was in labour, and she said she was going for a sleep, and I thought, okay, you're going for a sleep and you're in labour? I've never heard of the likes of it. And apparently she'd had one of these things you have in your back. Epidural. She'd had an epidural. So she seemed to be in labour to me a long time, and I remember saying to her, I said, you shouldn't have that epidural, you'd have had that hours before if you'd have just had it yourself. And she says to me, the only thing I can say to you, Mother, is next time I'll have it earlier. But she had 3 more children and she never had an epidural, and she had all 3 of them quite easy.
So Emma's birth, you were involved a bit more?
When Emma was born, Susan had returned to Redditch. Brian and Susan had bought a house in Redditch, and when Susan went into labour, I had to go and get Rebecca, because I had to look after Rebecca while she was in hospital. And I remember me and your dad, because your dad was still alive then, taking her into hospital, the 2 of us, to meet Emma. Long time ago now.
What about Rachel? Does anything stand out with Rachel?
When Rachel was born on Ash Wednesday.
So you were at church?
No, I remember being on the car park in Lidl's, and I got a phone call to say Susan had gone into labour. Rebecca was down in London with her nan, so I had to go and get Emma, because I looked after Emma while Susan was in hospital. And I remember taking Emma to see Rachel. We went and bought one of the Teletubbies little things, and she took that into Rachel.
What about Sarah, the last one?
I'm just trying to think about Sarah. I can't remember really much about Sarah. She was born quite quickly, and I must have looked after the kids. But I really can't remember a lot about Sarah. She was born in the same hospital.
So last question. Obviously you talked to Sarah and Rachel and Emma and Rebecca and at least try to give them some advice. What about your current and future great-grandchildren? What advice would you give them?
Just to be good and work hard at school.
So tell us about when Dad proposed to you.
I can't actually remember when he proposed to me, but I know when I got engaged, I was 16, and we put the ring on my finger under a bus shelter in Smethwick, which was where his cousin Renee lived. So I can remember all that, but I can't actually remember when he proposed.
Do you remember telling Nan?
That I was engaged.
Yeah.
Not really, no, I can't remember. I must have done, but I can't remember. It's a long time ago.
What about the planning for the wedding?
Oh, it was all a bit rushed, wasn't it? But no, I got married at Mount Carmel Church on July the 11th, 1964. And I forgot what I was going to say now. Oh yes, I got married at 10 o'clock in the morning, which is very early these days for a wedding. You wouldn't get married at that time these days, but it wasn't uncommon then. And there was a lot of people came down from Scotland who they couldn't believe that I was getting married in front of the altar, because in Scotland, if it was a mixed marriage, and I wasn't at that stage a Catholic, you couldn't get married in church, you had to get married in the vestry. So they were delighted that we were able to get married in front of the altar. Although it wasn't a full mass, it was a very nice service. And after that we went to the High Duty Alloys Social Club for a wedding reception.
What do you remember most about the day?
I can't remember an awful lot, to be honest, now. I remember I remember that Helen and Frances were bridesmaids. They were the little bridesmaids. And my cousin Susan and my friend Jennifer Rowe, they were the older bridesmaids. Tommy Clark was the best man, who was a football player with your dad when they were young. They played football together for years in different football teams. And yeah, it all went off without a hitch, I think. I don't remember any hiccups.
Did you have a honeymoon?
One night at it's a hotel on Mount Pleasant. I think it's an Indian restaurant now. Can't remember the name of it. We went there for one night and then back. We stayed at my mum's for a bit.
How long did you stay there? Because didn't you move in with your granny or
I
something?
did, yeah. I was there until after Susan was born, which was the Christmas of 1964. She was born on the 19th of December, which was a week before Christmas, and I came out of hospital on Christmas Eve. And in January I moved to live at my granny's, because I'd spent a lot of time with my granny's when I was younger, so and she lived on her own in this house in Sillins Avenue, so there was plenty of room there for us. Life there was quite hard as well, because when Susan was born I didn't have a washing machine, so every Friday afternoon after shopping I would go back down and the washing had to be done, so it was a matter of lighting the fire under the boiler in the bathroom and boiling the washing like that. So that's in my lifetime, and boiling the washing by fire. And my granny used to do the washing with an old dolly and tub. So all these things are fairly recent, really. There's been so many changes in my lifetime, as I've said before. Yeah.
So tell us about the early years of being married. What was your day like?
Well, in the morning I would get up and obviously get Susan washed and fed and dressed, and usually put her in the pram and out by the front door. And then about 10 o'clock I would start walking up to the town, and I would go to my mum's every day, because my mum worked in the plating shop at Terry's, and my stepfather, he worked in the grinding shop at Terry's, and they came home for dinner in those days. There was none of this taking sandwich lunches, so every day I went up there and I cooked the dinner for them. John and Ellen would be coming home from school.
By dinner, that's kind of lunch, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay.
But you had your dinner in them days, at dinner time, and you had your tea at tea time. So yeah, and then I'd clear that up after, and then in the afternoon I would walk back home. Yeah. And then when Susan was 11 months old, we got the keys to a flat in Batchley. And just down the road, at the same time, one of my friends called Christine, she was Christine Freeman before she was married. She lived just down the road in another flat. So every Tuesday and Thursday, Christine and I got in by that stage as well. We would get, and she had Jenny and, I can't remember if she had Stephen, I think Stephen's younger than you. But we walked to Redditch every day, and not every day, every Tuesday and every Friday. And we walked with the kids in the pram. Susan would be walking by that stage and he would be in the pram. And we'd go around the town and do the shopping, and then she went to her mum's who lived in Lodge Road, and I went to my mum's who lived down at the bottom of Lodge Road. And we spent dinner time with our mums and dads and whatever. And then in the afternoon we would meet up again and walk back to Batchley. Going to the clinic in those days was a big thing with your baby. A lot of my friends who had babies at that time, we all met up at the clinic one afternoon a week, which was in Bromsgrove Road. And that was quite an occasion, because that was when we all got together, we all talked about our babies, we all discussed who had put on the most weight and who was eating things that more so than other babies, and yeah, it was quite an occasion. So yeah, that were the kind of things that we did. And then every Thursday and every Monday I would clean the flat from top to bottom, everywhere, so that it was clean for the weekend, and then it was cleaned after the weekend. And I used to smoke in those days. I didn't smoke heavy, but I did smoke about 10 a day. And I smoked while I was pregnant as well, because nobody told you not to in those days. And if I had, in those days it was 10 bob, which was the equivalent of 50 pence today. If I had 10 bob left on a Monday, that would get me through till payday on a Thursday. That was all I needed, I would be okay. So things were much simpler then. We didn't have a car.
How did you do? What about the shopping? How was that different?
Well, we walked to Redditch, and it was done around Redditch town centre. The butchers would be in the town centre, all the grocery shops. There weren't no big supermarkets in those days. If you see all the old photos and that of Redditch, you'll see all the old shops up Evesham Street and down Ulster Street. And then there would be local shops. There was a local shop in Lodge Road that everybody shopped at, and in those days people used to get things on tick, and then they'd pay at the end of the week. They had a book. So yeah, it was just a much simpler life. I'm sure it wasn't as stressful. The only thing you had to worry about was having enough money to feed yourselves and keep yourselves warm. That was a big thing at Christmas. In those days it was coal fires, and I always wanted to have the coal house full of coal at Christmas. If I got coal in the coal house at Christmas, I was happy, because we could have big fires.
So what were those early Christmases like when me and Susan were both young?
Oh, they were great, because in those days Christmas was a big thing. Nowadays it's just another weekend really, but in those days you didn't have all these toys all the year round or whatnot. You know, Christmas was when you had Christmas presents, or birthdays were when you had birthday presents. So it was a big thing when Christmas came around, and you had all these things from Father Christmas. I think you believed in Father Christmas for longer in those days than they do these days. But you definitely valued your presents more. I remember when I was a little girl, one of the best presents I ever had, and I always remember it, was a sewing set. And I thought this sewing set was marvellous.
I remember getting an orange in my stocking or something.
Well, that was a big thing then, an orange and a pear or something, or an apple. That was just a symbol of, because I suppose going back to Victorian days, that's all they got. They didn't get presents, they just got an apple and a pear. But the Christmas dinner was a big thing as well, because you only had chicken at Christmas in those days. You didn't have, chicken wasn't a meat that you had every day. I remember when I was little, the chickens would get delivered to my granny's on Christmas Eve, and they still had all their feathers and guts in, and they had to be gutted and feathered for Christmas Day. So it was all so different, really. But life was a much slower pace.
In talking about it, it seems like it was a pretty happy time.
I think so, yeah. I think it was. People were much more satisfied in those days. They weren't striving all the time to get something else. You know, all these, somebody wanting to do better than the next one or whatever. People were quite happy with their lot.
So when you moved out of your granny's and you moved into the flat in Batchley, did Alan used to come and visit you there?
Well, Alan was in the Navy.
He'd already left for the Navy by then. So how often did he come home?
I think he used to come home fairly regularly. I can't really remember.
How old was he when he went into the Navy?
Well, he went in when Susan was 6 weeks old, I think. So that would have been 65, and he was born in 47. So he'd have been 18, wouldn't he?
Did he do his exams at school?
No, Alan got chucked out.
Oh, he got expelled?
Well, he was told he could go back, but he'd got to go back a year. Well, if he was supposed to be the ringleader of all the troublemakers, and what would that do? Put him back to younger boys, that would have made him just even more powerful, wouldn't it?
So did he leave at 16?
He did, and he got an apprenticeship down at, I think it was Reynolds Tubes then, British Aluminium. So he did that for a while, and then he went into the Navy.
So he must have done that for 2 years then, if it was a...
Yeah, and he got into the Royal Navy, and he ended up as a chief in the Navy. So
He was actually a warrant officer by the time he left.
was he?
Yeah, because he got his commission.
Well, then he did Open University and got a degree. So yeah.
Did you never think of doing something like that?
Well, no, not really. I never ever fancied. I never liked school that much, although I don't know why, because I was nowhere different. I was in the top set in maths in a grammar school, so I must have been fairly clever. And no, I was quite happy with my children and my life, and so it didn't do me no harm really. When I did eventually go back to work, I was at home for 9 years, and when I eventually went back to work, it didn't take me long to get promoted, and I ended up as an executive officer in the civil service, and I was happy with that. Yeah, I could have gone higher if I'd have been prepared to be more mobile and do different things, but I just was happy to come home from work and make the tea and make sure everybody was okay. And my mum looked after you and Susan. She would come up in the morning and take you to school.
Yeah, I remember all that.
And she would meet you from school. So you were never left to the mercy of latchkeys and whatever, as a lot of children were.
So, do you remember when Alan met Sue?
Well, Sue lived in Redditch, and she went to Lodge Farm School, as it was then. I don't remember when they actually met. But it was just before he went into the Navy. And obviously they stayed together and got married, and they had 2 children, David and Kirsty. And they lived for quite a while in Scotland. And although my brother and I have Scottish descendants, he wasn't very keen on Scots people. He made an exception for my husband. But he wasn't very keen on jocks.